All right. This video's topic is a letter from a Birmingham jail, which is the last of the foundational documents we have to review this year. It's written by Dr. King, and as the name implies, it's literally written by Dr. King in a Birmingham, Alabama jail. Dr. King was imprisoned for basically ignoring an order to not demonstrate or march without a permit, which he went ahead and did anyway. And while he's in jail, somebody smuggles in a copy of the local newspaper in which several groups had taken out an advertisement that criticized him for coming into Birmingham and causing problems, right? So this is his response to that criticism. So the first thing I want to focus on is the purpose. And again, this is the video that like reviews the slides that we did in class. So there's a lot of references like discussing with partners because this is how this was done in class. But the first thing I asked the partners to look at was like, what's the purpose of Dr. King writing a letter for Birmingham Jail and the purpose of like what he's just doing in Birmingham to begin with. So King talks about the need to fight against Birmingham's unjustness. It's important that you understand what his distinction is between a just and an unjust law. So his famous quote, or the quote in Letter for Birmingham Jail that relates to this, is let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and then it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. So the bottom line is that an unjust law is one that's made by a majority group that has no intention of following that law itself. It's just to punish a minority group, right? If it was just, the majority group would basically follow it as well. Also, an unjust law is a code inflicted upon a majority, which that minority has no part in enacting or creating. So the bottom line is, in this situation, the majority group doesn't even let the minority group have a say in the formation of the law, because in this case, African Americans have largely been barred from voting. So that's the purpose. He's in Alabama, in Birmingham, because of the unjustness that exists. Okay, the audience, like who is he directly writing this to? So he's really frustrated with three groups. First, he's frustrated with the church, like religious officials. Number two, he's frustrated with white moderates. And number three, he's frustrated with people saying that he has no business being in Alabama in the first place because he's from Georgia. He's an outsider. All right. So why is King frustrated with the church? He's frustrated with the church. He wrote, "In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church." Like laxity meaning inactivity of the church. Being a man of religion himself, I'm sure he was super frustrated with religious officials that preached about certain things during their religious services and then weren't following through on those principles that they preached about by like not taking an active stance against discrimination and segregation. So he was frustrated that religious officials were turning a blind eye to like all the injustices that were present in Birmingham. Also, he's frustrated with the white moderate. So King wrote, "The white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goals you seek, but I cannot agree with you in the methods of direct action." So, he writes in Letter from Birmingham Jail that he's not going to waste his time on like the Klansmen. And like nothing he's going to say is going to convince the Klansmen to support his cause. But he believed that the white moderate, which he thought represented most of the white population, agreed with what he was fighting for, but they were just made to feel uncomfortable by his tactics. So again, he's frustrated with the lack of involvement of the white moderate because the white moderate, he believes, actually supports the overall thing that King is fighting for, just disagreeing on the tactics. And then to those saying he's an outsider, his argument is injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. Basically, I'm from Georgia, but if I allow like injustice to exist in Birmingham, it could spread anywhere else, right? That just because it's in a different city doesn't mean that that couldn't impact me at some point. So that is his argument on why, even though he's not from Birmingham, why he belongs in Birmingham fighting against this injustice. All right, quick conversation about tactics. So, what's the overall purpose of King's protest strategy? So, King's all about nonviolent direct action, right? So, marches, boycotts, protests, things like that. And the whole point was nonviolent direct action seeks to create a crisis and fosters such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. So, what's the point of this nonviolent direct action? The protests, the boycotts, right? The demonstrations. It's to force the community because of the uncomfortableness of these direct action techniques to negotiate, which they hadn't been willing to do up to this point. So the nonviolent tactics are meant basically to put pressure on the local government to negotiate and to fix a lot of the problems that had existed. Um, King also obviously subscribed to the idea of civil disobedience. This was the idea of intentionally breaking laws, dealing with the consequences of breaking the laws in exchange for basically drawing attention to the unjustness of the law. Um, Birmingham, Alabama was chosen as a site of these nonviolent direct action techniques because it was basically led by an individual named Bull Connor, who is in charge of the Birmingham, Alabama police and fire departments. Previous to the marches and demonstrations in Birmingham, Dr. King had been leading marches and protests in Albany, Georgia. And one of the things that the local government there was they responded to nonviolent protests with nonviolent responses. And the media wasn't really interested in covering a nonviolent protest movement in which the local government responded using nonviolent techniques. So they needed to find a place where the nonviolent protests would be met with a more aggressive response from the government, and the media would then be more interested and more likely to cover this, right? Broadcast all these images out to the public, and then hopefully those images would win over the white moderate to being less inactive, right? So then how does King respond to those that say, hey, just wait? Birmingham, Alabama had just had new city elections. Why not just wait to see how those newly elected government officials deal with your demands, right? So King's famous response to that argument is we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given up by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered from the disease of segregation. So his argument is, of course, people that aren't negatively impacted by things like segregation are going to say to wait. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our own distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. The argument that wait is just basically a stall tactic, right? That we've waited long enough to basically have these problems removed and eliminated. And then the last part that I want to focus on is King trying to explain to people what the consequences of ignoring his movement are or dismissing his movement. So, what is King's warning to those that look at his movement as being too extreme, that aren't happy with his tactics? King writes, in part, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged, by now, many streets of the South would, I am convinced, be flowing with blood. And I am further convinced that if our white brothers dismiss as rebel rousers and outside agitators those of us who employ nonviolent direct action, and if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies, a development that would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare. So, what he's saying, without mentioning the person by name, is that Malcolm X really was the other side to the coin in the civil rights struggle. So while those like Dr. King were arguing nonviolent direct action, individuals like Malcolm X were arguing by any means necessary, including the use of violence to basically seize what they thought was rightfully theirs, which was equality of treatment under the law. So King's argument to the white moderate predominantly is if you feel uncomfortable by my direct action methods that are peaceful, there's a much more extreme movement waiting in the wings if you dismiss me, right? So again, this is a quick overview of our class discussion regarding Leonard from Birmingham Jail. It's the last of the foundational documents, and unfortunately, it's probably the one that we in 2024 can relate the most to because obviously the continued existence of discrimination and inequality that exists in our society today.